History books like to play it safe. They give us sanitized tales of brave warriors, noble leaders, and wise shamans wrapped in a tidy package of historical heroism. But let's face it, no civilization, no matter how impressive, was without its messier and bizarre moments. Buckle up, because we're taking a long ride into the lesser-known and slightly scandalous secrets of Native American history. Let's rewind a bit to understand how it all started. The relocation of Native Americans didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was the result of decades of tension, mistrust, and outright hostility between European settlers and native tribes. To grasp the full picture, let's examine one of America's most famous documents. You've probably heard of the Declaration of Independence. It's the document that kick-started America's journey as a country, but not everyone knows here. It contains a line that shows exactly how some early Americans viewed Native people. In the section where the writers accuse the British king of his wrongs, they claim, "He, the King of Great Britain, has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and he has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." Yep, you heard that right. The same document that talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness also calls Native Americans merciless savages. It's not exactly a hallmark of equality and respect. This sentence gives us a snapshot of how many settlers and colonists felt about Native Americans at the time. To them, Native people weren't just different. They were seen as dangerous, wild, and an obstacle to the settlers' dream of expanding westward. That bigoted view didn't fade away. Instead, it grew. Over time, these stereotypes made it easier for settlers to justify pushing Native Americans off their land. After all, if you believe someone is a savage, it's easier to convince yourself that taking their land, or worse, is somehow acceptable. And so these attitudes set the stage for policies like the Indian Removal Act, which is a law that forced native tribes to leave their ancestral lands and move west, often through brutal and deadly means. It all started with a pen stroke, an elegant script, and a dangerous idea. Before the Indian Removal Act became law in 1830, Americans argued fiercely about whether Native Americans should be forcibly removed from their lands east of the Mississippi River. President Andrew Jackson, a strong supporter of removal, claimed it was for the Native Americans' benefit. According to him, moving west would allow them to live peacefully and preserve their cultures without interference. But this reasoning was a thin cover for a harsh reality. Many white settlers wanted Native American lands to expand their farms and plantations. Jackson's stance painted Native Americans as incapable of living in a civilized society, portraying removal as an act of kindness when it was anything but. Not everyone agreed with Jackson's plan. Davy Crockett, the famed frontiersman and congressman from Tennessee, openly opposed the Indian Removal Act. He called it cruel and unjust, firmly believing that forcing Native Americans off their ancestral lands was morally wrong. Senator Theodore Frelinghuysen from New Jersey also pushed back, using religious arguments to condemn the act. He believed it was the United States' duty, guided by biblical principles, to protect Native Americans and honor their rights. Despite these voices of reason, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in American history. Widespread suffering, forced relocations, and the loss of countless lives. The Choctaw were the first tribe to be forcibly relocated under the Indian Removal Act. Living in what is now Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, they were one of the Southeast's largest tribes. In 1830, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek sealed their fate. The Choctaw gave up 11 million acres of fertile homeland in exchange for 15 million acres in the unfamiliar and less fertile Indian Territory, now part of Oklahoma. On paper, it might look like a fair trade for more land in exchange for less, but the reality was far from it. The land wasn't theirs and wasn't nearly as good for farming. The Choctaws' removal began in 1831 and unfolded in 3 waves over the next 2 years. The journey to Oklahoma covered over 500 miles, and they had to travel on foot during the harsh winter months. Supplies like food, clothing, and shelter were grossly inadequate. One group faced a blizzard during their march. Imagine trudging through snow and freezing wind for weeks with little protection. Many fell ill due to exposure and malnutrition, and an estimated 2,500 Choctaw died either during the journey or shortly after arriving. By the end of 1833, over 15,000 Choctaw had been relocated. In the northern Midwest, the Potawatomi Nation, part of the Algonquin-speaking tribes, lived on lands spanning Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and the southern Great Lakes region. But by the early 1800s, their hold on these lands was slipping fast. Here's the backstory. The Potawatomi sided with the British in the War of 1812, hoping to stop the Americans from taking their land. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The British lost, and the Potawatomi faced even greater pressure to give up their territory. By 1818, the Potawatomi had already signed over a dozen treaties with the U.S. government, trading their land for promises that rarely amounted to much. Between 1818 and 1828, they inked 7 more deals, giving away most of their Indiana lands. Then came the Treaty of Tippecanoe in 1832, which further complicated matters. Not only did the Potawatomi lose more land, but the treaty also demanded they move west of the Mississippi within 2 years. By 1836, the pressure hit a boiling point. That year alone, the Potawatomi signed 9 treaties. 9. The U.S. government was relentless, and one of their most cunning tools for these negotiations? Whiskey. Imagine you're at a party, and someone keeps refilling your glass. Before you know it, you've signed something you barely remember agreeing to. That's essentially what happened to the Potawatomi. U.S. negotiators would provide alcohol, a substance many Native Americans weren't used to, and use their inebriation to close deals that heavily favored the government. These whiskey treaties became infamous for their shady tactics. Potawatomi leaders, under the influence, often agreed to sell their land for much less than it was worth. Let's put it in modern terms. It's like waking up after a wild night out and realizing you signed the deed to your house away. Not exactly a great morning. The treaties promised the Potawatomi payments, goods, and small plots of land out west, often in present-day Kansas. But as history often goes, the promises were mostly empty. Payments were delayed or never arrived, goods were subpar, and the new lands were far from the fertile, familiar territories they'd left behind. Not everyone agreed to these deals. Chief Menominee, a respected leader in the Twin Lakes area of Indiana, stood firm. He believed the Potawatomi's ancestral lands were sacred far more than dirt and trees. To him and his people, the land was their spiritual and cultural heart. When the Treaty of the Yellow River, one of those whiskey treaties, was signed in 1836, Chief Menominee refused to budge. Why? Because he and his followers hadn't even been part of the negotiations. He argued that a deal made without their consent was no deal. By 1838, Indiana's patience ran out. Since the Potawatomi hadn't relocated voluntarily, the state called General John Tipton and a militia to force them out. What followed became known as the Potawatomi Trail of Death, a brutal 660-mile march to Kansas. In September 1838, the peaceful village of Chief Menominee and his Potawatomi people at Twin Lakes, Indiana, faced a terrible ordeal. Colonel John Tipton and his militia surrounded the village, giving the Potawatomi almost no time to pack their belongings or say goodbye to their homes. On September 4th, 859 members of the tribe were forced to leave everything behind and march west to Kansas. The journey was a grueling 660 miles and lasted over 2 months. Imagine being forced to walk that far day after day with no proper food or supplies while battling illness and exhaustion. The Potawatomi had little to protect them from the weather, and many were unprepared for the harsh conditions.
Things only got worse. Disease spread quickly, and with no real medical care, people, especially children and the elderly, began to die along the way. The cold and lack of nourishment took a terrible toll, and by the end of the march, over 40 members of the tribe had lost their lives. In the mid-1800s, the Navajo people faced some of the darkest chapters in their history. After the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, the U.S. gained a massive chunk of land in the Southwest through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This land overlaps with the Navajos' traditional homeland, a place they had lived in and cared for over generations. At first, there might be hope for peace. In 1849, the Navajo signed a treaty with the U.S. It was meant to end conflicts and promised the Navajo livestock, like sheep, to encourage farming. However, there was a catch. The treaty allowed the U.S. to build Fort Defiance right on Navajo land. Imagine someone building a house in your backyard and saying, "Don't worry, it'll be fine." Spoiler alert, it was not fine. The treaty also ignored big problems, like the Navajos' uneasy relationships with neighboring tribes, including the Utes. On top of that, the U.S. kept creeping into Navajo territory, sparking more tension. Among the Navajo, a leader named Manuelito rose to prominence. Standing an impressive 6 feet tall, he was no stranger to battle, having already fought against the Mexicans and rival tribes like the Utes. When the U.S. started taking Navajo land, Manuelito wasn't about to sit back and let it happen. By 1860, Manuelito had enough. On August 30th, he led 1,000 Navajo warriors in a bold attack on Fort Defiance. For a moment, it looked like they might win, but the U.S. forces managed to hold the fort. The Navajo were forced to retreat, and tensions only grew worse. The U.S. pushed for a truce in 1861, but it was far from fair. The Navajo were asked to give up large parts of their land, including areas tied to their sacred beliefs. 2 of the Navajo's 4 sacred mountains, which marked the spiritual boundaries of their world, were taken away. In 1863, Kit Carson, a famous figure of the American frontier, was given orders that would have a lasting and painful impact on the Navajo people. He was tasked with carrying out a scorched earth campaign, which meant he had to destroy everything that could help the Navajo survive. His army burned crops, demolished villages, and killed livestock. Carson's mission was to break the spirit of the Navajo, forcing them to surrender. One of the most significant moments came in the winter of 1864, when Carson's army surrounded Canyon de Chelly, one of the last places where the Navajo were still holding out. They destroyed crops, homes, and even more than 200 sheep. In the end, the Navajo had no choice but to surrender, with 23 fighters killed during the siege. After surrendering, the Navajo were taken to Fort Defiance, where they were forced to march over 300 miles to a reservation in Bosque Redondo, near Fort Sumner, New Mexico. This journey, known as the Long Walk, was brutal. Between 1863 and 1866, more than 10,000 Navajo endured the harsh desert conditions, with about 200 losing their lives along the way. Once they arrived at Bosque Redondo, life didn't get any better. The land was poor, and they couldn't grow crops, making survival even harder. The U.S. government provided minimal supplies: flour, lard, and sugar. But these were barely enough to live on. The Navajo began making fry bread, a dish that would symbolize their survival, born out of necessity during this difficult time. To make matters worse, the Navajo were forced to live alongside the Mescalero Apache, their longtime enemies, which led to constant fighting. Disease spread quickly in the overcrowded camp, and many Navajo died from illness. In total, about 2,000 Navajo lost their lives at Bosque Redondo. Finally, after years of suffering, the U.S. government admitted that the Bosque Redondo experiment failed. In 1868, the Treaty of Bosque Redondo was signed, allowing the Navajo to return to part of their ancestral lands. The Navajo referred to this return as the Beautiful Walk, despite their homeland being in ruins. Over time, the Navajo rebuilt their communities and herds. Though they had lost much, they were resilient. Today, the Navajo Nation is the largest federally recognized tribe in the United States, a testament to their strength and perseverance. The First Seminole War was a fierce battle that took place from 1816 to 1818 between the United States and the Seminole tribe in Florida. It was one of the early conflicts in what would become a long history of fighting between Native Americans and settlers in the U.S. But what makes the Seminole story unique is that a small group of Seminoles managed to stay in Florida and never signed a peace treaty with the U.S. government, even though most other tribes were forced off their land. Their journey was one of bravery, loss, and survival. In the early 1800s, Spain controlled Florida, but didn't pay much attention to the area. It was too busy fighting Napoleon's wars in Europe. At the same time, the United States was dealing with raids from the Seminoles and the Creek Indians, who lived in Florida, into American territory. 1816. President James Madison sent Major General Andrew Jackson to stop these raids. One of the first major events of the war was the attack on a fort called the Negro Fort, located on the Apalachicola River. This fort was a refuge for escaped slaves and rebellious Seminoles. It was a stronghold that launched raids into U.S. territory, which scared plantation owners in the South. They feared that the fort could inspire a large uprising of slaves. To stop it, Jackson ordered the fort's destruction. U.S. naval ships bombarded the fort with heavy artillery, and the attack caused a huge explosion when a cannonball hit the fort's gunpowder supply. The blast killed more than 250 of the 300 people inside. This explosion was so massive that it was one of the biggest in the Western Hemisphere. In 1818, Jackson was supposed to conduct a small operation to stop the Seminole raids, but instead, he decided to invade all of Spanish Florida. He captured important Spanish forts, including St. Mark's and Pensacola, and took control of the area. During this invasion, Jackson executed 2 British men, Robert Ambrister and Alexander Arbuthnot, who were accused of helping the Seminoles. This caused a big stir because the British were angry, almost starting a war between the U.S. and Britain.
Jackson's actions made it clear to Spain that they could no longer hold on to Florida. In 1819, Spain signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, agreeing to give Florida to the United States in exchange for $5 million. This treaty began a larger push by the U.S. to expand westward. Andrew Jackson, a military leader at the time, played a key role in making this happen and dealing with Native American resistance, especially during the First Seminole War. His actions cemented his reputation as a fierce enforcer of U.S. expansion and laid the groundwork for future conflicts. At first, no Native Americans were forced off their land right away. The U.S. had just gained Florida and hadn't yet started pushing tribes out of their homelands. However, the forced removals started with the Second and Third Seminole Wars. By the end of these wars, over 4,000 Seminoles were relocated to Oklahoma. The Second Seminole War was the larger and bloodier conflict. It started in 1835, when the U.S. tried to enforce the Treaty of Payne's Landing, which a few Seminole leaders had agreed to. This treaty promised the Seminoles would move west, but many, including the influential leader Osceola, rejected it. In a famous moment of anger, Osceola is said to have slammed his knife into the treaty in disgust. This defiance sparked a full-scale war. The U.S. government sent troops to force the Seminoles off their land, but the war dragged on for years, costing the U.S. over $20 million and claiming many lives. By 1842, about 3,000 Seminoles were relocated, but a small group of 400 to 500, led by Sam Jones, also known as Abiaka, refused to surrender. They became the only Native American group that never formally made peace with the U.S., and their descendants still live in Florida today. Abiaka was a respected leader and a master of guerrilla warfare. He knew the Everglades better than anyone and used this knowledge to frustrate the larger U.S. Army. Despite numerous attempts to capture him, he and his group remained free, becoming symbols of resistance and resilience for the Seminoles. Meanwhile, other tribes like the Creek were not as successful in resisting U.S. expansion. The Creek Nation had signed several treaties with the U.S., gradually giving up their lands. By 1812, the Creek were divided into two groups: the Upper Creek, or Red Sticks, who resisted change, and the Lower Creek, who had adopted some Western ways. The Lower Creek, led by Chief William McIntosh, worked with the U.S. to fight the Red Sticks during the War of 1812. After the war, McIntosh expected to be rewarded by Andrew Jackson, but instead, the Treaty of Fort Jackson took away more than 21 million acres of Creek land. McIntosh's people were outraged, but he continued to work to strengthen the Creek Nation. However, under pressure from the U.S., he agreed to give up even more land in 1821. The final blow came in 1825, when McIntosh and several other chiefs signed the Treaty of Indian Springs, which gave away even more land in Georgia and Alabama. The U.S. promised the Creek $200,000 annually, but McIntosh's actions angered many in his tribe. His betrayal led to his death, leaving the Creek much less land than before. This period marked a time of great loss and change for Native American tribes in the Southeast, as U.S. expansion pushed them off their ancestral lands, and the story of figures like Abiaka and McIntosh highlights the tough choices and challenges they faced. McIntosh's rival, Chief Minwa, led a group of 150 Red Stick warriors to storm McIntosh's plantation. Now, remember that McIntosh, who had become quite wealthy, was part of the group that helped create the force Minwa led. At this point in his life, McIntosh lived comfortably on a large estate. But all that came crashing down when the Creek warriors burned down his home and ended his life. 5 years after McIntosh's death, things worsened for the Creek people. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which opened the door for the forced relocation of Native American tribes. The U.S. government and the Creek Nation signed the Treaty of Cuseta 2 years later. This treaty was supposed to break up the Creek Nation's land in Alabama and give each family their piece of land. Families could either stay on their land or sell it, with the promise that the government would help them sell and prevent anyone from taking advantage of them. While the treaty seemed like a way to protect Creek families, it wasn't as fair as it appeared. Although it technically promised land, it also set the stage for widespread theft. Many Creeks were tricked into selling their land, and settlers pushed in on their territory, increasing the pressure to leave. By the mid-1830s, tensions were high, leading to the Creek War of 1836. The U.S. government quickly shut down the war and began forcibly removing the Creek people from their homes. They were marched hundreds of miles with little food, shelter, or medical care, and many were transported in filthy conditions on boats. Sadly, it's estimated that up to 3,500 of the 15,000 Creeks who were moved died during this brutal journey. By the 1840s, the Creek Nation had lost almost all of its ancestral lands in the southeastern U.S. In 1880, the Ute people were forced to leave their homeland by the Ute Removal Act, which relocated them to a reservation in Utah. This marked the end of one kind of forced relocation, but began a different, more hidden form of control, trying to change Native American culture by forcing them to become more like Europeans. One way this happened was through boarding schools. These schools were designed to erase Native American traditions and replace them with Western customs. The idea was to civilize Native children by making them forget their languages, clothing, and beliefs. The first and most famous school of this kind was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, which opened in 1879. It was created by Richard H. Pratt, an Army captain who believed Native children could be trained to live like white Americans. The government saw this idea as so important that by the end of the 1800s, it had helped set up 25 boarding schools far away from native lands. By 1925, there were over 100 schools nationwide, including some on reservations. When children arrived at these schools, everything they knew about their culture was stripped away. They had to wear military-style uniforms instead of their traditional clothing. Their long hair, often seen as spiritually important, was cut off. They were punished if they spoke their native languages, even with their friends. To make matters worse, many children were taken from their families and sent to these schools. Parents had little to no contact with their kids for long periods. Siblings were often separated. The sadness of removing these children from their families was especially harsh because many of the native families had already been forced onto reservations, which were small and isolated lands. Now, the government was taking their children away from those places they had been moved to. The last of these government-run boarding schools didn't close until the 1970s. That's right, the 1970s, not so long ago. The pain and damage caused by these schools still affect Native communities today. The legacy of Native American relocation is far more tragic than most people realize. While many know about the famous Trail of Tears, the forced relocation of Native Americans happened over a century and took place across the country. It wasn't just about one event. It was a long process of pushing Native Americans off their land, often by breaking promises made in treaties. Some of the most painful events in this story happened in the Northwest, including the Yakima War. 1853, the Washington Territory was officially created, covering present-day Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and parts of Wyoming and Montana. This area was already home to more than 24 Native American tribes. When the U.S. government took control of the land, it gave the tribes a harsh choice: leave their land or move to reservations. This decision led to the Yakima War, and more forced relocations followed. One of the most important tribes in the Northwest was the Yakima Nation. After the Washington Territory was formed, the U.S. government started negotiating with the Yakima and other tribes. In 1855, they signed a treaty requiring the tribes to give up 11 million acres of land in exchange for a reservation of just 1.5 million acres. That's a huge loss. 11 million acres for 1.5 million. Think about how unfair that is. The treaty also promised that the tribes could still fish, hunt, and gather food in their traditional areas outside the reservation. However, many tribal leaders later claimed they had been tricked or didn't fully understand the treaty's terms. This makes sense, considering that many of them couldn't read the treaty or speak the language it was written in. They had to make their mark with an X because they didn't know what they were agreeing to. Tensions grew as more settlers arrived in the region during the gold rush. Settlers clashed with the Yakima, and violence broke out. When the Yakima killed several settlers, and settlers killed several Yakima, it led to the Yakima War, which lasted from 1855 to 1858. This conflict shows the heartbreaking injustice Native American tribes faced as settlers took their land and pushed them off it. The coalition of northwestern tribes, including the Yakima, Walla Walla, and 6 other tribes, gave the U.S. military a tough fight during the Yakima War. Led by Chief Kamiakin, they scored a big win in the first battle at Toppenish Creek. They also managed to hold their ground in the Battle of Union Gap, even though they were outnumbered. But soon, things started to go downhill for the Yakima and their allies. The U.S. military quickly built forts and roads that allowed them to move more troops and supplies faster, giving them a huge advantage. At the same time, the U.S. used a sneaky strategy, dividing and conquering. While the Yakima and their allies were united against the U.S., not all tribes agreed on how to fight. Promises convinced some of protection and money, but these promises were often broken. This created division among the tribes and made them weaker. Meanwhile, another war broke out on the region's west side, the Puget Sound War. From 1855 to 1856, 9 tribes fought the U.S. over unfair treaties, including the Nisqually and Puyallup. They had been promised access to their traditional fishing and hunting grounds, but instead, they were moved to poor land with no salmon and barely any resources to survive. The Yakima and Puget Sound Wars ended in huge losses for the native tribes. They lost about 90% of their land. Though they didn't face the same forced marches as other native tribes in the east, they were stuck on tiny reservations. They couldn't leave without permission and were forced to live on land that couldn't support them. Meanwhile, settlers rushed in during the gold rush, taking over the land the tribes had lived on for centuries. Thanks for watching to the end. We appreciate all of our supporters and fans. Want to learn more about Native American history? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more cool history stories.